APUS History Review, Lesson 19, Antebellum Reform and Cultural and Intellectual Changes. We'd seen through this period from some of your earlier lessons. The Jacksonian era leading to the rise of the common man. We'd already seen in many of your lessons from your entire coursework so far the importance of religion in American history, driving motivations of the founders in terms of creating a city on the hill, going all the way back to the Pilgrims and the Puritans even, and the whole notion of American exceptionalism, the idea of America being a unique place. And so this ties into this period very much as we look at many new forms and tangential reviews and reforms going on that are going to try to change the American model and American experience. It was not one overall cohesive set of reform and review that takes place during this time period. It would be almost like if you took the reforms were almost like this. If you took a bucket of paint, turned it over and dropped it and saw the paint with the lid off and all the paint would stay on the ground. When the paint hit the ground, it would splatter out in a wide range of different directions. And that was what you have with these reforms. It was a widely tangential, different series of reforms that all wanted their own specific little things that they wanted to improve, to make better, and to change on their own. And they weren't as part of any overall unified master plan. And this is going to be a theme that you're going to see in United States history. The idea of reform as being a cyclical theme that goes and comes and comes and goes, that's rather important to always be an undercurrent, something that's sort of in the backstory in the background. Now, all this reform has all sorts of historic sources in it. One is the Puritan sense of mission, their whole sense of, providing for a unique city on a hill, the Enlightenment belief in the perfectibility of mankind in many ways, Jacksonian democracy, the access of a common man, and the worth of the common man to being a vital part of the citizenry, being the vital part of the citizenry in many ways, and changing relationships among men and women and their zeal of reforming classes to want to make these reforms, in many ways tying back into religion. And so your first slide is going to bring us to religious revival. And the Second Great Awakening should bring you the stuff that you learned already in your history class that we've talked about in our review sections, the First Great Awakening. And a whole lot of the reasons for the Second Great Awakening were to some degree similar. There's three main intended purposes, I guess, to the Second Great Awakening. First of all, improve the nation. Second of all, a rededication at the individual level for individuals, for people, to a life of worthiness. And third of all, it provided people in society with easy answers in a fast-changing world. Remember, this is the world where industrialization is taking over. This is the world of manifest destiny, the world of expansion, the world of new social classes, the world of widening gaps between rich and poor in a few ways, even though everyone's rising. It's a world where Americans are on the move. And in those kind of times, religion provided sort of a cultural touchstone that people could fall back on. And so the Second Great Awakening had many of the hallmarks of the First Great Awakening as a democratizing movement. It began with itinerant camp meetings like the First Great Awakening. It worked from the outside in. It worked from rural areas inwards towards the more urban areas of the United States. It was about accepting the concept that people could have a direct and vital personal relationship with God. And so it's an attempt to stop secularism, which was the more increase of people being involved in worldliness here, and bring people back to their own faith in the ways that were really important. And so backwoods circuit camp meeting preachers would ride circuit in the backwoods areas, have these big camp revival meetings, and you would have this direct communal relationship with God manifesting itself with, setting people on fire for the Lord, if you will. So much so that upstate New York was called the burned over district because the fire of revival had spread through that area. Now you saw with this many splinterism groups that come off in this whole revival model as well, as people were publicly declaring their faith and having these personal and emotional experiences as they sought a one-on-one community with God. The Mormons come out of this period, but also the Millerites are Seventh-day Adventists, which I guess you could say were sort of a millennial variety of faith, that were convinced that Christ was going to make his second coming right back to earth in 1842. This never happened, but it led to the modern movement of Seventh-day Adventism. But the idea was that judgment was upon us, Christ was and God were actively interested in what we were doing, and we're going to come back to make things right. So there's a definite religious fire burning an awful lot of people's hearts during this era. That's going to play important roles for political philosophy, or for political events that come up rather, and people's worldviews as it comes to territorial expansion, slavery, the rights of man, the rights of women, the rights of humans. That's all going to play a role. You have to look at that through the context of this Great Awakening if you're going to get some cultural insight into why individuals thought as they did during this era. This is an extremely religious age. Many of these reformers also tried to perfect the societies in which they lived. And so you saw transcendentalism being about this as well. It was sort of a philosophy that was not of the Great Awakening, but had some religious undertones to it on its own. The Transcendentalists, led by people like Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson, you've probably read them in your American Lit classes. Many classes do. Transcendentalism was the faith that ascribed to the idea that it's not an organized religion, it's more of a religious belief, that inside of each of us there's an inner light of God, and all we have to do is transcend, rise above some of the foibles of our own personal character, and we can rise above our weakness and achieve perfection. Everyone's got the potential to become Christ-like in their word, in deed, and their worldview. And the magazine of Transcendentalism, which distributed these ideas, was The Dial, which is published during this era. It's a useful term to know if you're having to write an essay or you see a multiple choice question asking about periodicals. This was the periodical of the Transcendentalist period. Now with this, Transcendentalists, they believed that if people were educated about society's evils, then those evils would disappear because people would seek to change them. If people could be educated, this almost goes back to some of Jefferson's ideas. The idea that people, if you could expose them to education, could improve themselves and improve their lot in life. And the idea is that you need to obey the higher laws, obey the law that is right. And this higher law issue with civil disobedience means that you do what is right, as in this Christ-like sense. The Transcendentalists argued that Christ would do. Obey the laws that are just and right, not the laws that are laws on the books. And this becomes the rationale in many ways for the Transcendentalists being abolitionists. And from the Transcendentalist point of view, the Mexican War, as a result, was an illegal war, an unjust war. First of all, they saw it as being a war of aggression, a bigger state picking on a weaker state. But secondly, the Transcendentalists saw this as a war that had a specific purpose of spreading slavery. So as such, Transcendentalists, such as Emerson and Thoreau, argued that they could not support this war, even though the popular culture and the popular economy and the popular government went along with it. As such, this also ties very much into slavery and the writings of William Lloyd Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison proclaims in 1831, that which is not right is not law. And when he does so, he's lifting directly from Transcendentalist thinking, saying that slavery might be legal, but it doesn't mean that we should accept it because it's sin and it should be done away with. It is wrong. And so we'll see the ideas of Martin Luther King, Mahatma Gandhi, in many ways coming from this idea of civil disobedience, nonviolent resistance to laws which are unjust or wrong. It's also during this point in time that you see education reform having nothing to do with Transcendentalism or having to do with religion. We see that prior to the 1830s, public schooling was largely unheard of. If a family wanted their children taught, they sent them to a private school, they tried to get themselves a tutor, they taught them in their own homes. By mid-century, we see this change, and you see schools moving away from the religious model towards a purely public secular model of schooling, which was there to teach basic skills of literacy and basic mathematics as a tool to assimilate the immigrant classes. Horace Mann of Massachusetts leads this after the 1830s as the first state to require mandatory public school attendance. The idea was to take the immigrant and make them whole. In many ways, this is not a backlash, but a reaction to some of the vast Irish Catholic immigration and the fact that the Irish would educate their own children in their own schools in a Catholic school model. This is sort of a reaction against that, to try to take the immigrants and assimilate them versus making war against these immigrant populations and always being in a contentious relationship. Take the immigrant and turn them into a full American citizen, teach them American values, expand democratic ideals. There had been colleges during this time, but they were usually associated with a religious denomination. So we're not seeing a whole lot of public funds at the collegiate level, not even at the secondary level yet. We're talking about mandatory or compulsory primary school education during this point in time. McGuffey readers were the primary teaching tool, which had the effect of both teaching literacy, but they taught literacy through sentences and phrases and paragraphs that children were taught to read that they also learned values from. Values like the importance of work, the importance of obeying your parents, the importance of respecting authority, the importance of saving, the importance of being thrifty, the importance of patriotism. So as children learned to read the words, they were also sort of unconsciously and subconsciously and sometimes very consciously ingraining and internalizing the ethics and values that were being laid out in the sentences that those words were made up of. It's no coincidence that you have a flowering of spiritual thinking, taking place at the same time as the invention of the steam engine tied to the printing press, which can distribute literature more, tied to, at the same time, a massive public schooling movement, which is going to lead to a blossoming of American literature. This is a great American cultural renaissance, and so many of the writers that you read about in your English courses they are born out of this era. People such as Hawthorne, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Herman Melville, Walt Whitman. We will not belabor a whole deal about their subject areas in the content of their works for our purposes here. My best advice to you on that is some of the advice I give to my own students, which is when it comes to transcendentalism in detail, when it comes to Melville in detail, when it comes to the realist school of writing and the romantic school of writing in detail, my best advice for you, pay close heed to your English teachers. Go back and fall back on your English notes about Poe, about James Fenimore Cooper, about Washington Irving, about Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, the themes and underlying currents that came out in your American Lit courses and your English classes will do you great service in general for having you understand a few things on backstory about what the themes were of these authors and what they wrote about in this early cultural national period. Hudson River School of Arts, I will talk about that just in one general sense. Hudson River School of Arts was dedicated as an American school of arts to the painting of landscapes, and you periodically see this show up in a format as a nice example you can throw in on a free response question about this era if they're talking about cultural renaissance during this era, or it can help you wind your way through finding a correct or incorrect answer conceivably on a multiple choice question as possibly a distractor, or simply knowing what it is will help you work your way towards process of elimination, getting rid of responses, or selecting responses that are useful on that A, B, C, D, E choice that you're going to make for a question.